The idea of taboos within Western culture and experience has largely taken on the meaning of something that is forbidden, something that is other. And in many ways, this is not seen as a positive thing, but as a protection against something negative or forbidden. The word taboo is originally a Tongan word, which means to limit or restrict, and often relates to spiritual practice. This idea of taboos is ancient, whether it's the Ewo of the Yoruba culture or the Gish of Celtic culture. The idea of taboos is something that is central to the spiritual practice of ancient peoples. We're all aware of certain cultural taboos, such as not eating pork, which is common in the Abrahamic traditions. The idea of shatnaz amongst religious Jews, that is, of not mixing two types of cloth, weaving two types, linen and wool together. And these prohibitions are largely seen as ways of keeping ritual purity, but also keeping you separate from the peoples who surround you. A fencing in. In some ways, one could argue, a limiting. But in more ancient traditions, the gish, or the taboo, is something that empowers the practitioner. In Yoruba culture in the Ewo, as well as in traditional cultures of the Americas, these taboos are highly personal. In the West, we do have a tradition sometimes of people observing unspoken taboos as a forms of preserving their luck. I, for one, when Australia used to have copper coins, found that if I carried a copper coin, it brought me very bad luck. And so my custom was that if I had a 1 or a 2 cent piece in my pocket, that I did not go further than 5 steps. And I would drop it on the ground. Now, the point of a taboo is not that you observe it and it makes it easy, but that it is an actual form of limiting and sacrifice around which one disciplines one's own core and one's own spiritual practice. For those who grew up learning fairy tales or fairy stories, very often the protagonist is warned in their sacred journey to not do something. And that if they do not do something, then they will succeed. This is a survival of this very, very ancient technology. In the tales of Oisin, the great Celtic Irish poet, he lives with the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danan in the Otherworld. And he loves it there, but he wishes to visit our world again, most especially to visit Neve. And he is told to ride on a horse, but that he must never get off the horse. He returns to our world and realizes 3 centuries have passed, and he wishes earnestly to mix with other people. And as he steps off the horse and his foot touches the ground, he transforms from being a young, healthy man to being ancient, decrepit, and eventually passing away, unable to return to the lands of the Shi, the Otherworld, where the Tuatha live. And in all of these traditions, we can see that the spiritual technology, which we sometimes call taboos, or the Gish of Celtic tradition, are a powerful tool in your own practice. But what do you take on for a taboo? And in this, you can be generic. Certainly, if you work with certain deities, such as Athena, you do not offer salt water or seawater. And if working with Poseidon, inversely, you do not offer olives or olive oil or olive leaves. And you wish to find out why, go back to the myths. And so we have to ask ourselves, what can we do to use this technology so as to further deepen our own spiritual practice? I am recently working with the Greek magical papyrus, and given that whilst much of the framework is an Alexandrine cosmopolitan Greek tradition, it is a magic rooted in Egyptian practice. And so, as I prepare to do certain workings, I take on the practice of abstaining from fish. Why? Because this was a prohibition of performing sacred work in ancient Egypt. In fact, before you took up your service as a priest, which would be for a short period of time of the year, 3 to 4 months, as you rotated, you were required to declare before the gods and the other priests that you had not consumed fish. Now, if you don't like fish, then this is an easy thing to do. Does that make it a gish? Does it make it a taboo? No. If you don't like something and you do not eat it, there is no withdrawing from the practice. There is no sense of sacrificing something to show, on one side, your dedication and focus to the practice, but also to place yourself between the worlds. A taboo is by its nature the stepping back from this world and placing at least your foot into the other world so that you stand between worlds. And the longer and more carefully you observe the taboo, the more power it develops. But the moment it becomes something that is not a sacrifice, is not a giving up of something, is not a stepping back, it is no longer a taboo. And this is an essential part of this practice, the taking on of something, by which I can step back from this world and declare not just to the universe, but to my own subconscious, that I am consciously placing one foot in the other world so that I exist between the two. And in this we can gain great power. But within the context of our spiritual lives, this is equally as important. Why? Because when we come to the end of our life and the journey moves into the next world, how are we able to willingly enter that next phase if we are still grasping at the things in this world? We are not truly returning to the She. We are not returning to Tinanok. We are not returning to the Otherworld, the Summerlands, or however you wish to frame them. The differing bardos, the differing tuats. These are all the same thing, even though they are framed in a different cultural perspective. You cannot enter the next phase if your foot is in this phase, this world, and you are hanging on by dear life because there is something you miss in this world. And so in that context, the taboo becomes a powerful technique in allowing us to transfer and move into the next world so that we are not returned back to this world to be trapped. And if you follow a more Gnostic spirituality, you will understand that this is a crucial part of our journey as spiritual beings, that we are seeking not to be trapped into the cycle of mindless rebirth, mindless birth and death, but that we are freeing ourselves to enter. And if we do this, entering into the other world, rejoicing only in the moment, not in what we had or have or want, then in truth we exist as the shining ones, the fair folk, the wee people, the Joego, the Tahadadanan, the numerous names that they are given. But the beings that exist in the other world and who travel to our world rarely, and we travel to theirs rarely. But that if we wish to embrace that reality, then we must live in the liminal now. And this is central to many profound and deep spiritual traditions. And now I'm thinking of the Vajrayana, the Tantric traditions, the spiritual practices of deeper spirituality that goes beyond the spirituality of faith and devotion, but into an enacted, active and holistic spirituality, especially one that embraces the Gnostic idea of transcendence, of transcending this and that, and to live comfortably between worlds so that we can exist in both. And this can begin with the Gish, the Ewo, the taboo, the observing of things. And what do we do? What can we observe? What can we give up? That is individual to each person. For me personally, I'm a water rabbit. And for a water rabbit, carrying amber, touching amber, owning amber brings really bad luck. And I do not carry or touch amber or own it, one, to preserve my good luck, to make sure that my spiritual environment is one that's healthy to me. But if I simply observe this as a prohibition and put it out of my mind, then all it is psychic first aid. But I actually find amber incredibly beautiful. I love its touch, I love its look, and do forgive me, I love the smell of it when you burn it. But I do not do any of these things. Why? Because I have found that if I break this taboo, then it causes me into a sense of spiritual imbalance, which manifests usually as bad luck. Everything from tripping, stumbling, to losing things, to things just go wrong. And yet, once I no longer have it, and usually carried tiger's eye and owl's eye as a counter, then I find that it allows me to be in balance. And yet, I still love amber. The not eating fish is really difficult for me. I love fish, salmon. But when performing acts of spirituality, if I am going to stand before beings that are crossing over from their world to this world, then I have a responsibility to also take steps towards their world. And so that where we meet becomes a liminal space, as we each have had to give up something. I give up, for instance, just the practice of eating fish, the joy, the pleasure of it. But they give up the bliss of the dimensional realm that they live in. And so it's a fair exchange. And when the time comes, through the observance of these little taboos, these little geshes, these little consecrations of our existence, whether these taboos are lifelong or whether they are in truth just small things, it can be as small as 9 days, 24 hours, only between the hours of sunrise and sunset, these are still valid sacrifices. They, on one hand, as we saw, help us by practicing discipline and focus. But on a more profound level, they allow us to let go of the anchors in this world so that we can step forward towards the next world and see beyond this realm, to develop spiritual sight and spiritual insight from which we gain wisdom. And with wisdom comes power, however you perceive that power. But we can start small. And by taking on this practice, find that it deepens the other practices that we do, and indeed the entire armory of our spiritual technology. And it all begins with giving something up. It all begins, as it did for me, in dropping coins to the ground and finding amusement as people behind you bemusedly pick it up, thinking they've scored something. Whereas you look at it and go, enjoy, because it doesn't belong to you anymore anyway. Because that is not the point of a taboo. I pray and hope that you find your own treasures that you give up, and with it gain something intangible, profound, and deeply spiritual, and thus, in your own way, become part of the other world, and thus live in practice the truly mystical life.